Chapter 35 of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 35 of Nicholas Nickleby. Read by Pistachio in Waxhaw, North Carolina. Smike becomes known to Mrs. Nickleby and Kate. Nicholas also meets with new acquaintances. Brighter days seem to dawn upon the family. Having established his mother and sister in the apartments of the kind-hearted miniature painter, and ascertained that Sir Mulberry Hawk was in no danger of losing his life, Nicholas turned his thoughts to poor Smike, who, after breakfasting with Newman Noggs, had remained in a disconsolate state at that worthy creature's lodgings, waiting with much anxiety for further intelligence of his protector. As he will be one of our own little household wherever we live, or whatever fortune is in reserve for us, thought Nicholas, I must present the poor fellow in due form. They will be kind to him for his own sake, and if not, on that account solely, to the full extent I could wish, they will stretch a point, I am sure, for mine. Nicholas said they, but his misgivings were confined to one person. He was sure of Kate, but he knew his mother's peculiarities, and was not quite so certain that Smike would find favour in the eyes of Mrs. Nickleby. However, thought Nicholas as he departed on his benevolent errand, she cannot fail to become attached to him, when she knows what a devoted creature he is, and as she must quickly make the discovery, his probation will be a short one. "I was afraid," said Smike, overjoyed to see his friend again, "that you had fallen into some fresh trouble. The time seemed so long, at last, that I almost feared you were lost." "Lost?" replied Nicholas gaily. "You will not be rid of me so easily, I promise you. I shall rise to the surface many thousand times yet, and the harder the thrust that pushes me down, the more quickly I shall rebound, Smike. But come, my errand here is to take you home." "Home?" faltered Smike, drawing timidly back. "Aye," rejoined Nicholas, taking his arm. "Why not?" "I had such hopes once," said Smike. Day and night, for many years, I longed for home till I was weary, and pined away with grief. But now—" "And what now?" asked Nicholas, looking kindly in his face. "What now, old friend?" "I could not part from you to go to any home on earth," replied Smike, pressing his hand, "except one. I shall never be an old man, and if your hand placed me in the grave, and I could think, before I died, that you would come and look upon it sometimes, with one of your kind smiles, and in the summer weather, when everything was alive, not dead like me, I could go to that home almost without a tear." "Why do you talk thus, poor boy, if your life is a happy one with me?" said Nicholas. "Because I should change, not those about me; and if they forgot me, I should never know it," replied Smike. "In the churchyard we are all alike, but here there are none like me. I am a poor creature, but I know that." "You are a foolish, silly creature," said Nicholas cheerfully. "If that is what you mean, I grant you that. Why, here's a dismal face for ladies' company! My pretty sister, too, whom you have so often asked me about. Is this your Yorkshire gallantry? For shame, for shame!" Smike brightened up and smiled. "When I talk of home," pursued Nicholas, "I talk of mine, which is yours, of course. If it were defined by any particular four walls and a roof, God knows I should be sufficiently puzzled to say whereabouts it lay. But that is not what I mean. When I speak of home, I speak of the place where, in default of a better, those I love are gathered together; and if that place were a gipsy's tent or a barn, I should call it by the same good name notwithstanding. And now for what is my present home, which, however alarming your expectations may be, will neither terrify you by its extent nor its magnificence." So saying, Nicholas took his companion by the arm, and saying a great deal more to the same purpose, and pointing out various things to amuse and interest him as they went along, led the way to Miss La Creevy's house. "And this, Kate," said Nicholas, entering the room where his sister sat alone, "is the faithful friend and affectionate fellow traveller whom I prepared you to receive." Poor Smike was bashful and awkward and frightened enough at first, but Kate advanced towards him so kindly, and said in such a sweet voice how anxious she had been to see him after all her brother had told her, and how much she had to thank him for having comforted Nicholas so greatly in their very trying reverses, that he began to be very doubtful whether he should shed tears or not, and became still more flurried. However, he managed to say, in a broken voice, that Nicholas was his only friend, and that he would lay down his life to help him. And Kate, although she was so kind and considerate, seemed to be so wholly unconscious of his distress and embarrassment that he recovered almost immediately, and felt quite at home. Then Mrs. La came in, and to her Smike had to be presented also, and Miss La was very kind too, and wonderfully talkative, not to Smike, for that would have made him uneasy at first, but to Nicholas and his sister. Then after a time she would speak to Smike himself now and then, asking him whether he was a judge of likenesses, and whether he thought that picture in the corner was like herself, and whether he didn't think it would have looked better if she had made herself 10 years younger, and whether he didn't think, as a matter of general observation, that young ladies looked better not only in pictures but out of them too, than old ones, with many more small jokes and facetious remarks, which were delivered with such good humour and merriment that Smike thought, within himself, that she was the nicest lady he had ever seen, even nicer than Mrs. Gruden of Mr. Vincent Crummles's theatre, and she was a nice lady too, and talked perhaps more, but certainly louder than Miss La At length the door opened again, and a lady in mourning came in, and Nicholas, kissing the lady in mourning affectionately, and calling her his mother, led her towards the chair from which Smike had risen when she entered the room. "You are always kind-hearted and anxious to help the oppressed, my dear mother," said Nicholas, "so you will be favourably disposed towards him, I know." "I am sure, my dear Nicholas," replied Mrs. Nickleby, looking very hard at her new friend, and bending to him with something more of majesty than the occasion seemed to require, "I am sure any friend of yours has, as indeed he naturally ought to have, and must have, of course, you know, a great claim upon me, and of course it is a very great pleasure to me to be introduced to anybody you take an interest in. There can be no doubt about that, none at all, not in the least in the world," said Mrs. Nickleby. "At the same time, I must say, Nicholas, my dear, as I used to say to your poor dear papa when he would bring gentlemen home to dinner and there was nothing in the house, that if he had come the day before yesterday no, I don't mean the day before yesterday now, I should have said, perhaps, the year before last, we should have been better able to entertain him." With which remarks Mrs. Nickleby turned to her daughter, and inquired in an audible whisper whether the gentleman was going to stop all night. "Because if he is, Kate, my dear," said Mrs. Nickleby, "I don't see that it's possible for him to sleep anywhere, and that's the truth." Kate stepped gracefully forward, and without any show of annoyance or irritation, breathed a few words into her mother's ear. "La, Kate, my dear!" said Mrs. Nickleby, shrinking back. "How you do tickle one! Of course I understand that, my love, without your telling me. And I said the same to Nicholas, and I am very much pleased. You didn't tell me, Nicholas, my dear," added Mrs. Nickleby, turning round with an air of less reserve than she had before assumed, "what your friend's name is." "His name, mother," replied Nicholas, "is Smike." The effect of this communication was by no means anticipated, but the name was no sooner pronounced than Mrs. Nickleby dropped upon a chair and burst into a fit of crying. "What is the matter?" exclaimed Nicholas, running to support her. "It's so like Pyke!" cried Mrs. Nickleby. "So exactly like Pyke! Oh, don't speak to me! I shall be better presently." And after exhibiting every symptom of slow suffocation in all its stages, and drinking about a teaspoonful of water from a full tumbler, and spilling the remainder, Mrs. Nickleby was better, and remarked, with a feeble smile, that she was very foolish, she knew,